Okay, then I think we can get started with our next speaker, Chris Nyland.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. I spent a lot of my time in my life in Germany, typically undertaking some form of exchange, whether it's a language exchange or whatever. You should probably view this talk in terms of being some sort of exchange. That's probably the best way I can describe it. Perhaps if I describe myself a little bit, you'll understand why. I probably don't fit the mold in terms of the majority of the people that have attended this talk. I'm a lawyer. Specifically, I'm a tax lawyer in England and Wales. That's how I qualified. I've always worked in real estate, always worked in national law or Big Four. Now, a lot of that might just sound like white noise in some ways. Let's try and sort of tie it in a little bit more. I do live and work in the only city that's ever made a panda Citizen of the Year, which is Birmingham. That was 2005. A red panda called Babu, which escaped from its zoo and lived at large in Birmingham for 4 days. I do mess around with Python and pandas when I'm not busy being a lawyer, a husband, or a father, which basically means that I do this on the train or when everybody else is asleep, which is a little bit less than ideal, but it certainly gives me enough time to be able to talk about something. Now, what I'm not going to talk about in relation to the world of tax and data are probably two of the hotter topics. That's because I think they might be more adequately served elsewhere, and partly because I think it's almost important to get this exchange program started before we start to really delve deep into various bits and pieces. There's a lot of data knocking around in tax. I can only speak for the UK Tax Authority, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, but everybody knows pretty much that they have these fantastic silos full of data in relation to various returns and all sorts of things that are filed with them at any given point. And they're getting very excited about data science and what it can do to help to try and close the tax gap. Equally, that's a sort of question as, you know, if only they knew what they knew. Equally, they're looking to actually try and sell anonymized data in the market. Now, for any of the talks that anybody's attended here, to, or if this is news to anybody, I think the frightening thing there is just how much probably people could divine from anonymized data if it were actually sold out in the market. But that's a data protection issue rather than any form of other data issue, although it's informed by data analysis. Again, I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about is, it starts with a basic value proposition, and it's simply this. I think small is beautiful. I think equally, just because something's designed for large-scale use doesn't mean it can't be deployed for small-scale use. And just because something represents small-scale use doesn't mean that it can't have a massive impact. To use a very, very brief analogy, if we think about language itself, not everybody is going to write fantastic poetry when they, if they're a user of the language, but it doesn't change the fact that the language is intrinsically useful to them to start with. Now, the sort of tenet of the talk is really to talk about the Pandas Thumb. Many of you may know the joke about, I don't know if you do, about the panda who goes into a bar to order a drink and says, I'd like a beer, please, and a bag of crisps. And the barman says, well, why the big paws? And he says, because I'm a giant panda. Now, pandas have paws. They don't have hands. And the consequence of that is they don't really have a thumb. But if you look at this chap here who's about to tuck into some bamboo, it looks an awful lot like he's actually holding it as though he had a thumb, which Stephen Jay Gould took a great deal of interest in and sort of analysed. And we moved from sort of the icon of WWF to a what the Dickens type scenario, where you have something called exaptation. This is a skeleton of a panda's hand, and if you look, you can count 5 fingers, and yet there is a protrusion here of an extra bone. Now, that's actually just an ordinary hand bone that the panda has co-opted over time to serve as a thumb, and muscles grow around it, and it works very serviceably if you are in the business of eating lots and lots of bamboo. It just works very well for holding bamboo. It's something that was never intended for the use. It's something that is quite a simple, quick and dirty, unintended workaround. And in many regards, that's kind of what I've tried to do with pandas a little bit. It's to scratch a particular itch. Now, what I'm going to say in relation to this, to give it its general context, is that tax and tax law is going through a bit of a sea change at the moment. Certainly, I feel it very much as a tax practitioner. It has lots of very particular needs. I happen to believe that pandas is blessed with the attributes that are necessary to actually fill those needs. There is a bit of work to do. Now, to understand tax at its most very, very basic level, you've almost got a continuum here. You've got two things. You have probably innovative planning and then compliance. Now, one is sort of thinking outside the box at the very edge of the law. The other is thinking in the box, keeping your head down, and then also ticking all boxes as well, just to make sure that you're actually not only doing it right, but you're telling the government that you're doing it right as well. Very simply, compliance is more important than ever. Compliance actually needs a lot more commoditization to be lucrative, and commoditization is hard. The reason that planning is dying is partly because people are running away from planning. They're running away from it from two reasons. One are the courts of the land, the European Court of Justice and the Court of Popular Opinion. Both are pushing against people actually using what we might construe as aggressive tax planning. Those sorts of things are over a little bit. Now, partly that might be the Occupy movement claiming victory. Partly it's also because legislation is beginning to trickle in and it's being backed by wins in the courts for the tax authorities that says, well, no, we need greater transparency, we need accuracy. You're going to have to tell us lots more. We're going to track things much more aggressively. And there's a series of regulations called SAO, or Senior Accounting Officer. They're not only obliged to have the right answers, but the right systems to consistently produce the right answers as well. These are new, very, very novel concepts. And can create a bit of an issue for people when they're just really predominantly working in Excel, and that's about it. That's all they're doing. They're having to cope with very, very new phenomena. There's also a push to avoid vendor lock-in a lot of the time for the provision of these services, and people are pushing much, much more for standardization. Now, the problem with compliance is that it doesn't really attract big fees. It used to be that you'd promise to do this sort of thing so that you'd be, in with the client and make sure that you got the very sort of sexy tax planning that might go with it. It came from less complicated times when there weren't so many boxes to tick. And then apart from that as well, you can't charge a huge fee for something when you're just paying the right amount of tax. People tend to get a bit more excited and will pay you a little bit of a reward if you find some way of reducing tax liabilities. If you're just actually ticking the boxes for them, it tends not to make them want to pay. So you have to try and cut cost. Cost is the key area where you try to defend some sort of margin in relation to matters. Now, the problem with that is that tax doesn't lend itself very well to commoditization. It's very complex. It's very, very black and white, only if you get down to 100% zoom. Otherwise, it looks very grey. And the typical tax lawyer response to things is often, it depends. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. There are multiple variables. And if that wasn't problem enough, the law can change extremely frequently. As a bare minimum, it tends to change about once a year. And even if one area of tax law changes, it might have a huge impact in another area of the code. I'll show you a little bit later why when we sort of go through a tax engine. Now, a lot of tax engines tend to sort of chew up a load of data and look at it at a very, very high volume and spew out an answer. And they can be very effective for very, very specific questions. So till rolls and payrolls are the typical areas you might see this. Let's say you have a very, very large supermarket or convenience store and it has all of the sales data that it's generating in a particular year. You can take a tool, you can sort of, tax engine will go through and try to spot anomalies between an item's classification code and the tax code that applies to it. Similarly, on payroll, you can sort of spot anomalies where people seem to be earning a certain amount, but it's not being picked up by the company when it's taking the appropriate amount of income tax out. They're very weak on contextual data. It's not really a forte for them. Sometimes you could argue that they're solutions in search of a problem. They do one thing well, but it means that people have to walk around constantly just to say, well, can I try this? Can I try this? It makes it a little bit more difficult. So you're looking instead, if you're trying to cut costs and to be able to deliver on compliance, you're still looking at something like mass customization. Now, what that means in its simple terms is you've got to have empowered practitioners in tax. You basically need people who can still do decent levels of analysis but have the proper tools for the job. And in that regard, a lot of people are butting up against the constraints of spreadsheets because they just don't do the job in the way that might be necessary for tax. And the key problem, and you'll begin to see where I'm going with this, is that one thing that spreadsheets don't do well at all is something that's very, very important for tax, and that is to be able to allocate figures to particular periods on a particular basis. Typically, you'll sort of have headline amounts of money, tax rates that apply to it that change over time because the company's years don't run at the same time as the tax authority's years. you need to apply reliefs, and the relief codes can change over time because they get cut, they're reducing, they're being staggered or whatever. And all of that has to be done as automatically as possible. And then having taken all those different layers, you then have to weave them into a narrative quickly and effectively. Now, without giving the game away too much, it's fairly obvious what that solution might look like. Pandas absolutely devours tax calculations. It is exceptionally good at doing them because of the very simple fact that it can take complex commands, build them into a complete time series. It can then weave those time series into a data frame that you can use in some way. And they're both sort of off the grid, so you can have lots of different inputs and different outputs. You're not constrained by the medium of the spreadsheet alone, really. And they're also quite elastic, so you can start to flex things as time goes on. You can build lots and lots of different facets into it. Now, I think Pandas really can lend itself very well to tax analysis for the simple reason that there are sort of two things. Generally, in the UK, you would tend to have tax practitioners sometimes who aren't necessarily legally trained, but on mainland Europe, you'll tend to find that tax practitioners are lawyers first who then go into tax. Now, for Python generally, when you talk about people who've got some form of legal training, then you give them an excellent frame of reference. You give them something that can make a lot of sense to them. There are a lot of transferable skills between what you would do to draft a contract, which is in essence, a form of coding for a human behavior and what will happen in certain circumstances, if-then statements, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive coverage of particular scenarios and particular fact patterns. In many regards, you could say that lawyers have been doing TDD since before Charles Babbage could even say difference engine. It's something that has existed for quite a long time, that we'll sort of be able to do these things. Now, Python then has the hook in that it's got Zed Shaw's book or some similar sorts of books that are very, very accessible and very good for people who have absolutely no experience whatsoever. That's not to say that they'll start from scratch. They'll bring a lot of transferable skills in that they can then upskill very, very quickly into Python itself. It is a medium for safe experimentation. There's a lot of excitement in the UK with Raspberry Pis, and a lot of people are suddenly actually not worried that they're going to blow up their computer and will happily sort of buy a Raspberry Pi and tinker and experiment with this sort of thing. There's the openness and freedom, obviously, and the flexibility, but there's option to standardize as well. Now, that's Python generally. That's kind of the hook in on the law side in some ways, but on the tax side then, Pandas has some particularly useful means when you're looking at this sort of thing. It does have an excellent frame of reference. So, PricewaterhouseCoopers, which is one of the 4 largest accountancy firms in the world, undertook a survey in 2013 of 100 leading CFOs, so chief finance officers, and asked them whether they foresaw that they'd be getting rid of spreadsheets anytime soon. And 65% said probably not, but 85% said that they were absolutely keen to try and do something a little bit more sophisticated. Now, if you tell them they can have the benefit of spreadsheets in some ways, but actually have additional flexibility and power beyond that, then that gets quite exciting to them. And when you think about transferable data and what you can do with that, you've obviously got Felix's excellent Excel wings and lots of different means for people to start tipping in from spreadsheets. There are gateways now to enable people to actually work on this sort of thing. And obviously, in the same way as Python might arguably have Zed's book, Pandas has got Wes's book, which is just an absolutely phenomenal guide and can walk even someone like me through the basic making of Pandas data frames and managing big data. I can't deny that Pandas can sort of ride on the coattails of the big data hype, which there's a little bit of a time lag in the law. We're fundamentally a very conservative profession, and we tend to only just be catching on to the fact that this might be a good thing. That's not to say that I really buy into it. It's to say that it's a hook, and it's very, very useful when you're just trying to pitch these things to people. And as I say, there's Pandas tax superpowers that really nothing else covers in a satisfactory way without a hell of a lot of VBA coding or whatever. So the idea might be that you've almost sort of got pinstripe pandas or white-collar Python. I'm not advocating new technology. I'm just saying actually in tax, there are a lot of new techniques that people could use. And actually, it wouldn't take a lot to train a lot of people to sort of wean them off spreadsheets and onto data frames and to pandas with a form of, it's very open box, very democratized, and enables them to do things much more easily. Now, that might result in one of two things. It might result in what I would call tax bots. That's little things that fundamentally solve a big tax problem, a tax problem that someone just gets annoyed with, or it's a little paper cut that you have to deal with on a daily basis. Alternatively, what it might be able to do is sort of provide a bridge. It's a sort of a sketch or a prototype that you could then use to actually go to someone who's a proper Pythonist as opposed to someone who's dabbling a little bit and say, well, look, I'm trying to do this. I'd like to take it another step further. I'd like to build something cool. And it just facilitates that dialogue in a way that that dialogue isn't there right now. It's there on finance, and it's in its relationship with Python and PyData. It isn't with tax, and yet tax relies on has very similar requirements to finance. It's just a lot more sometimes about percentages than about numbers and ticks. And its event horizon typically runs on a year as opposed to on the millisecond or the second. Now, there are some challenges. One or two of them are just things that can be ironed out very easily. Pandas won't willingly leap and roll. That's to say, on its rolling sums and rolling means, it tends to be able to count on days. It tends not to be able to count on a calendar year, so you can't do a rolling average or rolling mean from today looking back one calendar year. It doesn't quite work in that way at the moment. There are workarounds, and they're a bit janky, certainly things that I've written, but it is doable nevertheless. There is a need for training, because as I say, this is the exchange program. I'm pretty much the only person I'm aware of that's doing this at the moment. But that's not to say that eventually there might not be some hook into it. The evangelism, I guess that falls to me to a certain degree within the tax law community. Standardization is probably less important, but what is potentially important is probably just to have a quick look at proof of concept. If we can sort of prove to a degree that something that a lot of lawyers or tax lawyers hate can be sidestepped very neatly using pandas, then that hopefully is a hook in. Now, in those terms, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about ORVILLE. Now, hands up anybody from the UK? Okay, so there are one or two people who will attest to, when you say ORVILLE to somebody in the UK, most of them think about a flightless green duck in a nappy. That isn't, I actually named as a kid my blue bear, and my parents didn't send me for colourblindness testing apparently, after said duck, and I've sort of named the software as a backronym after that, which is the Overlap, Rent-Free and VAT Integrated Lease Liability Engine. ORVILLE addresses a very, very particular itch in tax, and that's all. It looks at one tax, it's called SDLT, which is stamp duty land tax. The stamp duty bit of that derives from a tax that was introduced, or throwback of taxes introduced in the 1600s by William of Orange, and the land tax was then, sort of bit was bolted on when it was all rejuvenated and modernised in 2003 by the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown. So in some ways you could argue that the story of SDLT is that Brown is the new orange. Some bits of it have always remained very much the same as it goes. So for argument's sake, actually this already guested, stamp duty has been here before, or stamp duty land tax has bobbed up in PyData, specifically in London. Philippe Braca did an excellent talk. And in his analysis of transaction values over time in London underneath the £1 million bracket, you can spot two very distinct lines. One line is the vertical, which is Christmas, generally, because conveyancing solicitors tend not to want to operate at Christmas time. It's hard to move money around when the banks are shut to buy a house. The horizontal line is the threshold for stamp duty land tax. So as people come up towards where a rate might actually change, the way that rates work on some bits of stamp duty land tax are that once you go a pound over, the whole lot is then taxable at a higher rate. So you can see people sort of butting up against the very, very edges of a higher rate. Lease duty was modernised a little bit more. It didn't remain the same, and that became a bit of a difficulty, really. The way that lease duty used to work was that you took a lease and you worked out how many years there were in the term of the lease when someone granted an occupational lease to somebody. You worked out what the average annual rent was and you applied a very specific delineated percentage to all that and average annual rent for 1 year. It was very nice, it was very neat, it was okay. What you did was, having worked that out, you went across to the stamp office, as it was called, and you would present an original document, say the completed lease, and they would stamp it, and you get, that's it, this is sort of what you pay for, the duty due for the stamp, and then that document could then be registered at the land registry, so that, in older times it could have been picked up by Felipe's excellent chart. And that's very good. The lawyers tended to hold the documents. Because the lawyers held the documents, they therefore were the people that were in charge of this. And in fairness, multiplying an average annual rent by a fixed percentage was about as much as they could do. And it was okay, it was all right. When SDLT on leases came in, they had a very, very different proposition, and that was partly because leases had become immeasurably more prominent in the intervening 300 or 400 years. And SDLT on leases taxed instead every pound of rent paid for every day of occupation, for every consistent area of demise at its general level. Now, somebody pointed out that the time value of money should be brought into account in relation to this, and so the government accepted. And it said, well, okay, it's the net present value of the rents then, and we're going to tax them at one of two particular bands. Now, in terms of the net present value, the formula that they used is set out there, and you might commonly recognize it as NumPy bug number 649, where I equals 1 instead of 0. That's just the figure that's used for determining net present values on a 3.5% discount in the UK. NumPy might have been a bit of a help, subject to all the other complications I'm about to mention on its own, but it isn't anymore anyway. But the basic effect of it is that you look at rents, you look at the first 5 years, you find the highest rent in the first 5 years, that's deemed to be the rent for the balance, and then you just NPV it off. That's as simple as that, really, and then you just tax at the appropriate rate. The problem is that involves quite a lot of arithmetic and quite a lot of preparation, and that is actually probably, when the accountants looked at this, they probably had a land grab. They could have gone for this. They could have brought it in-house. They could have done it. But it's a relatively low-value tax. I mean, the tax is 1%. It's not massive. They didn't see a lot of value in it. They didn't want to do it. And they just said, well, you lawyers have always dealt with it. Carry on. But you might imagine that we become lawyers and we're chosen to be lawyers because we're averse to sunlight and garlic and that we can't be killed by conventional weapons. Actually, it's a little bit more straightforward than that. And generally, you end up being a lawyer largely because you're bright-ish and you can't do numbers. That seems to be the sort of career progression path that pushes most of us into it, and that's how we end up there. So to leave them to deal with any form of arithmetic already is a bit of a hassle. So HMRC rode to the rescue and said, well, look, we're going to create a web app to deal with this. And so, it's very nice, and we'll set out, you just tell us when the lease starts, when it ends, and enter the first 5 years rent, and away you go. And that should be absolutely fine, but there are a couple of problems. Firstly, it was very late to actually come out, and so for a long time people had to sort of make it up as they went along. There's a lot of offline preparation, ironically, that goes into just entering those basic bits of data. You've got an I/O bottleneck generally anyway, and it also has quite limited application. SDLT overcomplicates things because it tries to catch too much when it comes into leases, and very good articles have pulled it apart far better than I can. But basically where you do have something where actual things are deemed not to happen and notional things are deemed to happen, and you have credits and disregards all the time, you do have a problem when you're just trying to deal with basic arithmetic. For starters, SDLT looked at a textbook to work out when a lease started, which is great, but it doesn't reflect legal practice. So you generally had to count from a different point. So from the grant of the lease, you had to look forward 12 months. That might take in lease year 1 with a particular rent and lease year 2 with a particular rent, but with a bit of iffiness or a bit of non-overlap there. So you have to start doing time apportionment calculations almost every time. The reason for that is because no lease really is ever granted on its term commencement date. Landlords generally want all leases to end at a particular time in a cycle, so they'll often backdate the official term commencement date for a lease. That's problem 1. Problem 2 is that then you'll often have rent freeze injected in there. Problem 3 is that VAT, which is the sort of equivalent of IVA or Mehrwertsteuer or TVA, changes over time, but you have to pay SDLT on that as well. So you've got a lot of multiple variables there, and then a couple of extra fictions and disregards. If you had a lease that was for this long for 10 years, and then you decide you wanted to be in occupation for a bit longer and you're going to pay a bit more rent, that sort of happens, and you agree that's the new lease. But there's a bit of overlap between those two, and the consequence is HMRC says, well, okay, we'll let you have a credit for the rents you've already paid tax on, so you have to reduce that as well. Now already we've got a couple of different things that all have to be prepared by lawyers before they ever get to the stage where they're going to input these things into a simple web app. Now, generally, they're doing these things on paper, with pen and paper, with a calculator, and if they're very lucky and they're not just counting days on a calendar, they'll actually use timeanddate.com, but it's not very sophisticated in terms of how they do it, and there's nothing worse than the face of a property lawyer when they come to you to show their calculations and what they've done, and you said, you've forgotten VAT, or you've done this, or there's something not quite right, because they're not just generally able to tweak one thing. So that gives them a general headache. And then the other problem is that this is a very limited application. These are extracts from HMRC's Stamp Duty Land Tax Manual. And there are plenty of excerpts that just say, yes, we did prepare a web app, and here are lots of instances where it doesn't work and it just will not work. And the result is that generally you have to go to spreadsheets, and that's where it generally comes to me when I have to do it. So if we sort of look at spreadsheets for a very, very straightforward lease where very little changes, but there's just a slight overhang on the rent, then there's a bit of manual calculation there. Now, everything has to be prepared by hand generally. There are a couple of bits of Excel foo or spreadsheet foo that you can undertake, but it's a bit of work. And then, oops, what's going on there? Can I make this down here? No, why is that happening? If you then add an extra complication of the fact that the rent rate changes midway through, then you have another issue. If you start introducing differential value-added tax rates as time goes on, you've got to start splitting these years again. So you've got extra data manipulations that you've got to try and undertake. So this starts to make things really pretty difficult. Now, by comparison, if you just sort of fire up ORVILLE, which, as I say, is sort of, is a little tax engine that does all of the hard work of almost building a data frame that's equivalent to the spreadsheet and does it in sort of back end, then if we just have something that's nice and straightforward, let's have a look at this one. So yeah, that's. I wish I knew how. Hang on a sec. Sorry? Is that working? Cool. Okay. So let me run this now. Okay, so this will actually just very quickly generate the equivalent of the spreadsheet it might have to do and then collapse it all back down and summarize it. But what it's doing is creating this on a daily basis to try and deal with problems. But the data entry is very straightforward, and you can just sort of hack around with the various bits and pieces. So you could change the rent so that it suddenly had extra variables in there, like there was VAT or there was a term shift. It's all very, very straightforward to do by comparison to actually hammering these things through in Excel or in LibreOffice. And you can just generate the figures that you require very, very quickly. And if something changes or you're not certain on a fact, you haven't got to sort of stop and not do anything, you can at least do some general figures while you get some further information from the client. And there's enough in terms of what the lease object that exists, or the lease class, I should say, that exists within ORVILLE actually does, that you can add things in. So VAT, if VAT is payable on usual quarter days on current rents, it gets caught. You can add in a rent commencement date, which is first rent com here. You can change first rent itself, which is just a dict, which then feeds itself into a data frame that builds on everything from there. That makes life a good deal more straightforward. Now, in terms of what it's doing, what it does do is it builds an initial data frame, takes in minimal variable inputs to start with at the front end. You haven't got to do a lot of manual data entry. It pulls in and bolts on ready-made things that we just know are the case. I know what the VAT rates have been for the last couple of years in the UK. I don't have to reinvent it every time unless I'm doing these things manually. But you can take applicable VAT rates, you can take predefined variables, and then you just put them together, upsample them in FFill, and all of a sudden you've got a very, very nice data frame. Then you have to deal with some of the legal concepts, like the fact that it's the highest rent in the first 5 years. My very quick and dirty response to that is just to slice the data frame very quickly, create a new one, and just bolt them back together again with a concatenation. I'm sure there are better ways to do it, but this way works perfectly well for me at the moment. If anybody does have a suggestion, I would always welcome it. Now, there are quite a lot of disposable columns that you can play around with a lot more when you're not dealing with spreadsheets. Now, you guys know that. But people who are just sort of generally viewing things through a spreadsheet, so I wouldn't know that they can do that. And you can also do lots of cool things just to make it very lawyer readable, or so easy a lawyer can make sense of it, by just having quite a few group bys. Now, at the moment, it also outputs, for posterity's sake, to CSV files that then can be saved on the digital file for a matter. So at least people know, what the calculation looked like, what the variable inputs were, and that way, we just have something to work on if, down the line, there are additional things that are actually required. And then beyond that, as I say, it just falls to actually sort of re-summarize the point here. It's to say that tax is really butting up against spreadsheets as some means to actually be able to deliver on the new demands that are being placed on it. Pandas, I think, is exceptionally well placed to be able to deal with those needs because it can cope with the ambiguities of law and it can cope with things much more readily because it can deal with a lot of that stuff off the grid, if you like, in terms of what turns up in the data frame. It can just filter things through before they get into the data frame to start with. It's very, very handy. There's a lot of work to do, as I say, in relation to it, but at least as a proof of concept, I've made something that would ordinarily take, say, 1.5 to 2 hours of a lawyer's time at appropriate rates down to something that can be done in a few minutes with the right tool. And that's quite a compelling proposition. It's not the sexiest thing you'll ever see. It's certainly not the most complicated thing that's been here. But what it is valuable nevertheless, because even though not much seems to happen in relation to it, if you present it in the right market, it means a great deal. And to lawyers generally, and to tax practitioners, these are the sorts of things that they need to know about because it can make their life immeasurably more straightforward. They won't be coming here with, as I say, great deals of input or whatever, I don't think, really, to the scientific Python stack. But the flip side to that is that they are quite able to sort of, draw something meaningful from it that's valuable, even if it looks like it's very, very straightforward to you. And that's a fantastic position for you to be in, that you have a skill that is exceptionally highly valued elsewhere. And that's it. Well, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
So I wonder how the tax office checks these calculations and your taxes?
It's a very good question. Tax in the UK is done on a self-assessment basis. So they just trust that you're going to do it yourself properly, and then they just rely on the system of audit to check it. The more readily you can point to a proper audit system, the better, and that's what the senior accounting rules, or senior accounting officer rules are designed to deal with. But if you haven't got anything, or at best you've got a printout from the web app that sort of says, well, I did this, and they'll say, well, how did you come to these numbers? Often the record, the lawyer's scribbles on the back of an envelope might not be on the file, and everyone just sort of shrugs their shoulders and they're not quite sure. This gives a much more sort of transparent accounting trail, if you like. But the short answer is it's very hard to reverse engineer some of these things a lot of the time because you've got people who can't do math doing it.
And second question, is there an official set of test cases where they have a validated output for certain situations? Do they say, does the tax office say this is the right amount of tax you should pay?
No, there aren't. There's nothing of that sort at the moment. And as I say, generally they will rely on people themselves getting it right. They tend, compliance type stuff, making sure that you get the figures right, tends to be an issue that's sorted out before it ever gets to the courts, for argument's sake. It's just a tax officer coming and saying, I'd like to see how you've calculated this. It's principles of law. So as it not, did you put this number in correctly, but should you put this number in at all? That tends to be the sort of stuff that ends up in the courts. I don't blame you if you have no more questions, by the way. That's quite enough tax law for one. Oh, no, brilliant. That's,
so have you presented this to other lawyers? What did they think, or what are your current plans for advocating it?
This is very much a side project at the moment, as opposed to... So when I speak to friends who are in the profession, whether or not they're at my firm, they're excited by this sort of thing, of the idea. Generally, I think at the moment, it's just a massive help for me, because it makes my job a lot more straightforward. But in the longer term, I think even, as I say, there are sort of two levels. There are tax practitioners themselves. I think they're the next step, or they're the gateway for this sort of thing. What they're delivering is a service to property lawyers. Now, for those property lawyers, they probably would need something that's got a Flask front end, and you can do a few bits more straightforward. I think even they might balk even a sort of IPython notebook. But I do think that that's possible as a second step.
Cool. It looks good.
Thank you. Thank you very much.